Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, or on the bottom of page 1325. So we began the third Eifen Gimel, the third manner, the third type, the third form of Hamtakas Hagvudas, the sweetening of literally severities, judgments, but it also includes the darkness, the concealments, everything that this world represents where the divine is concealed. And that ultimately leads to the different forms of judgments and severities, even the harshest, like he said, the Gvuras Kashas we learned about, especially in Rosh Hashanah when you talk about the prosecuting angels and the Satan and all of that. So the sweetening all of that, but this time, in this third manner, it's the Gvuras Nimtakim Mitzad Atzma. They're being sweetened not through Chsadim, Shalei de B'chinas Chsadim Klal. It's not coming from a force outside of them, it's coming from within. And this is the Iker Hamtaka Amitis. That's how he describes it. Among the three types, this is the primary, a true sweetening, where we say that the Ein HaGvuras Nimtakin Ela B'Sharsha, that when we say Gvuras are not sweetened only in their root or in their source, in their root, referring to this third level. So even though we talk they are sweetened not in their root through the first two types, that's why he says is Iker Hamtakas Amitis, Iker Hamtakas Amitis. So that's what the statement means, that the Gvuras are not truly sweetened in the fullest sense of the word, in the true way, and the primary way, only through their source. So to explain this, he said we'll understand it from the Chassidus. The Chassidus are the spices, the 11 different types of spices that were brought in the temple, and they are generally represent, this is hapche, he says. In the Zohar and Kisvei Arizal, whenever the Rebbe says, the Rebbe Rashab or Rabbi says Zohar and Kisvei Arizal, you see that it's a fundamental central theme that the way Chassidus is understood, he doesn't even bring a source, a specific Zohar, Kisvei Arizal, but in general just says that the Chassidus Yedua, it's known that in Zohar and Kisvei Arizal, what are Chassidus? That is the Hamtakas Hagvudas B'Sharsha. What we're describing here, that's what the Chassidus represent. This third level of sweetening from within. Or rather, I should say, I'm talking in their source, and that means that the sweetening is from within. So from the Zohar, it's clear that this is Gvuras Nimtakim B'Sharsha. Now, explained it even on a technical level. What are the Chassidus? You take sharp, where he calls it Dvorim Charifim B'Yeser, very sharp and sharp items that give off a sharp, emit and exude a sharp aroma, and they're not food, as he's still going to compare to karbonis, which is the smell, the aroma that comes from something that we consume, we eat. They're not a dvar meichel. On the contrary, samim him k'may samim hamazikin lenefesh. They're toxic, and yet what happens is you then transform them. And they're transformed, they're not just neutralized, they're transformed to be very powerful, beautiful aroma, and they give off a lot of strength due to their sharpness and their power. So that's even on a physical level. And we spoke about examples, medication examples, or even in perfumes. It's very powerful perfumes. I'm not talking about synthetic ones that are derived from some of the most unpleasant odors. But that unpleasantness, when you remove the toxic, you can turn it into a very powerful, positive fragrance. So same thing now. From this, we understand the Chassidus Beruchnius. That is what does the Chassidus come to accomplish? It wasn't just to make the nice smell in the Beis Hamikdash. Even though there are those that write that because of the smell of all the karbonis, the Chassidus was essentially like a what do they call them? odor, good smells that you have when you put them in bathrooms or other places. What are they called? Whatever they are.
Air purifier.
Yeah, air purifiers. Here, they also represent Beruchnius. What do they represent? Lahamti kol adin and akoshim b'sharshan. To sweeten all the judgments in their root, shenafochim l'teiv mamish. And that's the ra nepach l'teiv mamish. Okay, so now we have kabbonis. Basically, Chassidus is the concept of isapcha, but not the transforming of the Gvura through chesed, which was the type number 2, but this is coming from within itself. Transformation from within. And that's the difference between Karbonis and Chassidus. Karbonis also give off reich necheach. They also have an aroma, a fragrance. But that's a reich from a dover hanechal, from a food. And the Chassidus is something that's not consumable, that's not a food. And as we explained, food represents something that you can eat, which means it's edible, it's not poisonous. Whereas here we're talking about something that could be samim, like he says, so that's why transforming ra to toiv. So the karbonis, though he doesn't elaborate here, but in other places it says the karbonis is a transformation more of the animal soul, which we know is klipas neiga. It's not purely evil. Whereas the Chassidus can take something really negative, like he's going to explain in a moment with tshuva, and transform that. Okay. In the parentheses, he just qualified that when it says in Eitz Chaim that in the Chassidus, the chayis, it's the chayis of Gedusha B'techa Klippa. So it's true, it's the holy energy, the divine energy within the Klippa, but it's nivla, it's been absorbed and swallowed up by the item. So it needs to be transformed. So the fact that there is a spark in there, or there's chayis the Gedusha, that doesn't necessarily mean it's been transformed. It just means it's there. And the Chassidus transforms. Okay. And he gave the example of one of the 11 spices is moir. So moir is, I looked up more details as I said I would. So let me just give you some of that. So moir is in the pasuk we brought from Merdred, we bring in Pasuk Kisisa, where it talks about the Chassidus. So there are two opinions, the Rambam and the Ravid and others. And this is all brought by the Alter Rebbe in the Torah that he cites afterwards in Purim. I think it's Taf Tzadik Tes Amud Gimel, 93c. That the bottom line is, the Rambam says, more comes from a chaya, the chaya yoduni. Here he calls it yodua. But it's an animal, and there's two opinions whether about this animal. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's opinion that moir refers to a plant, or a shrub, or a herb. But bottom line is, we're talking here, according to the opinions, dam chaya nikri yadua, shenepach ba'asmi v'nasa beisam tev, and that itself gets transformed and becomes a beautiful fragrance. Now, in Torah he brings two opinions. There's an opinion that you're allowed to eat this, muter b'achila, and there's an opinion it's not muter b'achila. And the Alter Rebbe explains there that's the two opinions, whether it's Dainis Naslik, whether it's tshuva, that completely transforms deliberate sins into merits, and that makes it kosher, that makes it mutter b'achila. And the opinion says that you can use it for fragrance, but not to eat. He says that's the opinion that that it's not a complete tshuva, it's a tshuva that just transforms deliberate sins into inadvertent ones. Zochius to shgogis. That's what he says there. What's relevant to us is here he wants to bring obviously the deeper form of transformation, that it is muter b'achila. And what is that? In other words, you don't just use it as you can use it as a fragrance. Everyone agrees. It's one of the Torahs. That everyone agrees. But whether you could also eat it, that was dependent. And here he brings that opinion, which is that it transforms even the most negative into, not just neutralizes it or weakens it, but into merits. So makes it mutter even in achila, not just as a fragrance. And that's what he brings. Okay, so now we've established that Chassidus is the inyan of transformation. And what is it? Naveda. This is the last piece we learned. So I'm going to go over this now. V'hu inyan hatshuva de bali tshuva amitim. And it's the second time he's mentioned the word amitim, because there are a lot of levels of tshuva, as I just said. There's a tshuva miyira, for example, a tshuva that comes out of reverence that is only transforms deliberate sins to inadvertent ones. But tshuva ma'ava is a deeper tshuva, that's like a tshuva amitis, that completely transforms it into merits, not just eliminates the sins. Remember, we learned about Neisa Oven, Kavish Oven. So there we also talked about whether the sin is neutralized or it's actually erased. But there it was all coming from chsadim. Here he's talking from the third approach, the third type of transformation from within. So this is tshuva amitis, bal tshuva amitim, from the depth and innermost part of their soul, with a very deep remorse or deep bitterness on the fact that they're so distant. Like I described, like hitting rock bottom, that the sins and their transgressions, brought them to a place that they feel so embittered by their situation, by their matzav, to the point they literally literally means loathe their lives. But he means here loathe their lives, the state of their life. Doesn't mean here, God forbid, suicidal necessarily. He means here that they loathe how far they've fallen, how distant they are from the divine, and that very sheer power of that feeling, which is so deep in their soul, it's a negative feeling. Obviously, it's not a feeling of love; it's a feeling of complete disgust of how dark their lives are. That causes nepach be'etzem mahusem merah gomer l'teiv mamish. So this is the Chassidus in Aveda. You've taken something which became something that was a terrible aroma, smell, odor, to the point it's dangerous for the person. He says, "Samim mazikim lenefesh." What is that spiritually? A person who's gone so far away, and they feel that feeling of feeling so distant, that alone is the catalyst that catapults them to transform themselves. And that is this higher level of tshuva, which ultimately is the full transformation from within. So this is not like the bitter of the Yetzer Hara, the refinement of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, the animal soul that comes through Avodah al Pitam V'das. Al Pitam V'das, it's like, okay, you have an animal soul. It's temptation, it tempts you, but you battle with it, and with the logic and rationale, you figure out a way and you strategize, and you can even persuade the animal soul to go along. There, it's not etzem mahus. It didn't. What's the word? Hazaza. It didn't shake to the core the animal soul. The animal soul was convinced for whatever reason. But here we're talking about a person who's come to a point of literally like pekuach nefesh. They feel that they feel desperate. There's a desperation. It's like a person who sees themselves trapped in a burning building, spiritually or psychologically speaking. That's a very different type of motivation. That's not just saying, okay, I'll improve my life and become better. That touches the very core, and that does, like he says, the whole being is transformed of the animal soul. So though he doesn't say it explicitly, but karbonis is more like the avodah al pitam v'das. You're working with the animal soul, which is the representation of the behemoth that you're bringing on the mizbeach hachitza, in the outer altar, in the Beis Hamikdash, which was where they brought offerings from animals. That's the first avodah. That does not transform it completely. Chassidus is brought in the inner mizbeach haprimi, mizbeach hazov, made of gold, which was in the kodesh. And that Chassidus, that is the deeper level of tshuva, of total transformation. Doesn't say that explicitly here, but it says in other places just to round it out. So that's where we stopped, 3 lines from the bottom of page 1325. So yesterday I gave the example of hitting rock bottom. I was just thinking about it since we learned yesterday. You know, the psychologists wonder, why is it indeed the fact that a person does hit rock bottom, in the sense, you know, why not just hit rock bottom and that's it, and you're stuck? Some people do get stuck. But what is it that happens there? So usually it's understood, as I said, desperation. You get into such, when things like if they talk about a functioning alcoholic or a functioning addict, if they're functioning and they're working and they can deceive themselves into thinking their life is working, their marriage is all right, they have business. There are people who are addicted, but they know how to maneuver. When you hit rock bottom, you come to realize, let's say gambling or other addictions, that no, it's gotten to a point that's out of control. You're hurting your own self and your family and your finances, and you realize you're not functioning. So that's usually seen. You can't deceive yourself anymore. In other words, you come to a point where the darkness is clearly dark. Not like the Baal Shem Tov says that the darkness can conceal that it's dark, and denial, basically. But based on what he's saying here, you could say, perhaps, that there's something else going on. Not just that you've come to a point of no return where you've hit rock bottom and there's only one way is up, but perhaps the very fact that a person could get to such a dark place is rooted, sharshe, remember the Gvuras Nimtakim B'Sharshan is rooted somewhere. It's rooted in the ultimate Helama Atzmi, that God is fundamentally in a state of concealment. So even though that concealment is a holy concealment, and there's nothing negative about it at all, but in the other extreme, when it's nishtalshel, it evolves to the lowest level, is the utter concealment where nothing is working, where a person comes to this point of desperation. So besides the desperate aspect, perhaps when you hit that, in some way it triggers the sheirish of Gvura that in a way is ultimately saves your life. In other words, God in his mercy helps a person to come to a point where they will wake up when it's dark enough. There's an expression in the Gemara that Mashiach will come either der shekule zakai or der shekule chayev. Either when all the people of the generation will be meritorious, meaning merits, or they'll all be chayev, they'll all be the opposite. We'll have no merits. So everyone understands, of course, if a generation has full of merits, of course it's the time for Mashiach to come. But why would Mashiach come when there are no merits at all? I mean, the whole point is that through our merits and through our mitzvahs, we bring Mashiach. So one of the explanations in that is because God is there too. God is there in the deepest darkness. And when there's half merits and not merits, in a way, you have some light and some darkness. But when you have complete utter darkness, that too, even though it's not a way that we should even plan on, it's not an approach. You don't go echte v'ashuv, I'll sin in order to hit the darkest place, so then I can access the highest levels of Helam Atzmi. It doesn't work that way. It's if it happens, just like a Baal Tshuva. You don't sin in order to get the quality of tshuva. But if it happens, whatever reason, a person made the mistakes, even if it was deliberate, and the tshuva is true tshuva, it triggers this deepest level of Gvuras Nimtakim B'Sharshan. The shadish of the Gvura is always there behind the scenes, and in many ways, that's what really wakes up the person. But this time it's coming from within. When it's coming from chsadim, it means it's not triggering that aspect of Gvura itself. It's the chesed of the nefesh alakis illuminating and educating and training and impacting the animal soul, whether it's the first level of sweetening or the second level, but it's coming from a force of light. Oir is illuminating the darkness and transforming it. Now it's cheshech itself from within itself is being transformed. I just thought that's an interesting, if that is indeed the case, I mean, of course, he doesn't say this explicitly in psychological terms, but it would give a very fascinating explanation why indeed that concept exists. It's so common today, where people go for help only when they hit rock bottom, or only when they really are desperate, or they come to a point that they see clearly there's no way out. As long as they think there's a way out, or even deceive themselves to think there's a way out, they can fool people. It's like that. People who lie and they get away with it, so they do it again. But you come to a point where you really can't go anywhere. There's no room to wiggle. So then that in turn triggers perhaps this highest level where the transformation comes from within. So in a way, it's when we say Baalei Tshuva who did Tshuva, what happened was God in mercy, in a place where they were, allowed something from the very root of the Gvura to awaken them, even though it could come from Chesed too. Listen, it's true that many people meet somebody and they wake them up, they inspire them, they teach them, and so on. But sometimes it comes from the other extreme, that things that are so bad there's something some point where that itself awakens the person, like he says, mitzad atzmei. And I just wanted to throw that into the equation here. So let's continue reading unless anybody wants to comment or ask anything. I'm happy to pause. If not, I'll read on from the third line from the bottom of the page. Anybody? No? Okay. So now the Rebbe Rashab continues. So he compared the bir of the Yetzirah Nefesh Habamis al Pitam V'das, which is more a gradual process, a more rational process, and tshuva, which does not transform the person fundamentally, and tshuva that does. But now he's going to say this tshuva, that this itself, there are levels, obviously. So he says, "Va'ikir hu ba'tshuva haboy de'esedus hanefesh habamis ba'atzmei." The primary transformation that we're discussing here is the tshuva that comes through an awakening of the animal soul on its own. Why is he saying ikar? Because we did learn the nefesh halikis could awaken an animal soul. And there are things outside of the animal soul that can awaken it as well and help transform it. It's just not the full transformation that he's saying. So the ikar that he wants to refer to here in this third method or style, or this third type of sweetening, is when it comes to nefesh habamis ba'atzmei, like I just explained. Shaloi. Sha'atzeres nefesh habamis ba'atzmei shaloi. What's that? Advatu aboy da'atzeres nefesh habamis ba'atzmei. Shaloi tsar ma'od ma'inyonim shaloi. I'm not sure how to read it. What's it? Advatu aboy da'atzeres nefesh habamis ba'atzmei shaloi. Okay, he's basically saying that it's very distressful to him from the state of being where he's come to. In other words, it's not coming because he sees the light and someone has shown him. In the case, the animal soul, the divine soul has shown him the way or shown him a better way. But it's sar loy ma'od. Usually the expression is sar loy ma'od. Here he's saying it. That's why I was trying to about they said it's ba'atzmei shaloi ba'atzmei san ma'od ma'inyanim shaloi. Yeah, that is very distressed and from hinyanim shaloi, and that shezeh magia, and that touches, that reaches be'emek nafshe b'yeser, in a very deep place in his soul. That distress. Tehine, because now hanefesh halikis, the divine soul, Hagam Shaloi Negei Harichuk Yeser. Though the divine soul also feels distance. When the divine soul comes down to this world, as we learned earlier, and it has to engage, remember, it's Beislapshus. It doesn't just come passing through. The divine soul manifests inside of a body and inside of an animal soul, and it's in a deep golus. I'm referring to on page, if you go back to 1308, he described it in detail. In the beginning of the paragraph, he said the nefesh halikis is nisalim, in this gabrus achumri is the nefesh habamis, to the point of a golus. We say that the neshama is in a state of golus. So you can imagine, how does the nefesh halikis feel? Take a prince who is living in heaven, completely connected to his king, the Father, his godliness, without any encumbrance and without any impediments and any blocks, is able to contemplate and feel and experience godliness. And you throw him, like all the examples, taking the prince out of the palace and throw him to some distant land in a prison where he now has to engage with and deal with a body and an animal soul, health issues, temptations, and everything the animal soul schleps him. So you can imagine how painful that is. Like he says, Shahari Madregas HaKedusha. Because the Nefesh Halikis comes from Kedusha. Take Kedusha and put it in a place, in a prison, take a king and put him in a prison, you can imagine how painful that is. So it's also negate to him the Richuk. He's comparing it now to the Richuk that the Nefesh Habamis feels. So he says the truth is Nefesh Halikis also does, Hagam, but he's going to qualify. Even though the Nefesh Halikis feels it deeply, like he says, Negei Harichuk Yeser. Why? Because he knows what Kedusha is. The animal soul doesn't originate in such a holy place. The animal soul was never a king. Here you're talking about a nefesh elikis in its purest form before it comes into this world, is in the palace, is in the most beautiful possible place in Gan Eden, which is, by the way, why a child cries when it enters this world. There's a lot of pain when it comes to this world. That's why neshama al karcha chatachai, you have to force the neshama to come because it doesn't want to enter this world. Why would anyone want to come into a dark, hostile world? We have to contend with all the challenges we have, the pain, the suffering, health issues, death, injustice, abuse. I mean, the list goes on, in addition to all the things about how distant we are from godliness. And even a neshama that's not on a high level. A neshama of a tzaddik for sure feels it that way. But he's saying now, even lower neshamas, in Tanya chapter 2, where he brings about souls. So he brings that there are types of souls. There's souls that are the Reish, Bnei Yisrael, leaders, but there's also souls on the level Akfayim, he calls it, the heels, that are like, compared sometimes to the nails. They come from the more external levels. So he says, even a low soul, and Shvela, a Nemuch is a lower and a lowly one. Next page, B'Yesher, increasingly lowly. Page 1326. She b'chinas gasus haruach. The soul, relatively speaking, is in a state, gasus haruach literally means coarse spirit, thick spirit. In other words, it doesn't have the same refinement and edelkeit and subtlety of a higher soul. The Mishum Zeh, the Rebbe Rashab explains, and that's why a soul of a lower level, nitfeses v'nisreches b'yeseh b'chumris hanefesh habamis. That's why it's more imprisoned by or contained by nitfeses. There's more of a grasp. The animal soul has more grasp in it. And nisreches from the word sirche. When you say a sirche is like a lesion, the lesions in the lungs that makes an animal not kosher. So Chassidus brings that this causes lesions in the soul due to the animal soul has more impact on these lower souls. In the coarseness of the animal soul, even such a soul, because it's a divine soul, it's just a lower level. It still retains the fact that it still comes from divine holiness. Like he says in Tanya there, chapter 2, it's also chelik alakamim al mamsh. Only it's gone through many garments. It's more concealed. It's on a lower level, but it's still not the nefesh habamis. It's only affected more by the nefesh habamis. And therefore, it touches it and affects the distance from godliness. Even the lower souls are affected by. So if that's the case, so then why are you saying that a distance that the animal soul feels reaches deeper and therefore transforms the very person? He's not asking the question as a question, but he said Hagam. Even the divine soul actually in ways feel the distance even more. And even a lower level of a divine soul. So he says, no, nevertheless, Makol Mokim, and this is the explanation. When the awakening comes from the divine soul, that feels the distance. And it's awakening itself, and also the animal soul for that matter. Being that the nefesh alekis, the divine soul, is fundamentally a holy and sacred level, because it's a piece of the divine, even though it's very embittered and very bitter about its distance. Like we said, a prince, a king, it's thrust into a prison, completely antithetical to its very nature. Being that it still retains Kedusha, it doesn't go to a point that it completely is so, it becomes so completely it's completely restless, and it despises its very life. It's not in that desperate state. It's very painful and very bitter, but remember, he knows he's a prince. The Nefesh Halikis never forgets that it's a divine soul. So it never has a situation where it's total darkness. It's just been thrown into a dark state. So it's extremely painful and extremely traumatic. We're not denying that, but since it comes from Kedusha, the Kedusha didn't disappear. It's just now trapped. So he says again, Necham is like from the word menucha. So you can't say that it's in that way that it has absolutely no peace at all. The yimas b'chayev legamri, and completely despises its situation in life because it's still coming from Kedusha. Let's see the contrast. But when the animal soul gets awakened or stimulated or aroused due to its very darkness, not due to the nefesh alikis, and it comes from klipas nega, because remember the nefesh abamis is from a Jew is klipas nega. It's not gedusha. Nefesh alikis comes from gedusha, which means a connection. Klipas nega is true. It's not shalosh klipas atmeis, which is completely off limits and completely a place where there's no in any revealed way at all. It's from klipas nega. Which I think the Rebbe Rashab is saying that tell us why would it then get a Hisedus? Because it is klipas nega. It's not complete off limits of shalosh klipas atmeis. I think that's what he's saying. But regardless, klipas nega, you could also say the opposite. It's from klipas nega, not from kedusha. So the klipas nega goes both ways. So he says, Hina Hisedus shalai, its stimulation, its awakening, who she'ena meitze nuchem lenafshe klal, umoy is b'chayev mamish. When it becomes aware of its state, it doesn't find any peace, has no rest at all. Completely desperate in that way. I will say the word desperate is not the word he's using, but it doesn't have any moment of respite. Umoy is b'chayev mamish, and despises literally its life, meaning the state of its life. And wants to completely, basically, this really does mean to kill itself. Wants to throw himself out of the window, so to speak. It doesn't say that word, but lahashli chayiv meneged legamri means he want to do anything to get out of this place. Completely at loss, completely ready to. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't. I can't say the word suicide because that's not the exact definition, but essentially does not want to live. Is that what it means? Ukamoshin is boily ill, as was explained earlier. Dibra maschal kiseitze hagimel. So he says that's on volume 1, page 610. That I want to look up. I want to see what he says there. Actually, I have it right in front of me. Let me see if there's something there, just because it's pretty strong words. Just want to see if there's some more explanation on this. Tafresh Yud. Oh yeah, okay, now I remember. Yeah, he gives an example there, may be helpful here. And imagine two people join together to be partners in crime. And they go, I mean, this is not, he doesn't use this example per se, but he uses an example of I'm going to use a stronger example. Two people are partners in crime, they murder someone. Rahman al-Islam. But one of them is the one that incited the other. So even though the person who participated and was not the initial instigator, he feels terrible what he did. We're talking about when they're in the state of doing tshuva. But at the end of the day, he was dragged along by the other one. Whereas the nefesh habamis is like the insider. He's the one that caused the problem. So his regret and his remorse is far deeper because he's the one that really pulled the trigger, so to speak. Whereas the other one participated. Now, this doesn't take the other one off the hook. They both became involved in this crime. But it's just an example of different levels of where The second one, once he feels regret, he's completely like doesn't want to live because he realized what he did. Again, this doesn't minimize the first level, but he just uses that. I'll look at it a little more, and I'll give more information after Yom Tov when I want to look into that chapter a little more in detail. But if you want to look it up, it's on page 610 in volume 1 of Ayin Beis. In the original volume 1. Now the reprint is probably it's probably volume 2 or 3. Okay. So that's what he says in the Maimer Kisei Segimah. So before I continue, so he's explained that even though the Nefesh Elikis also feels deeply the distance and is embittered by it, and in many ways even more so because it goes what Gedusha is like, but at the end of the day, it's dark, it's despondency, and its negative feelings are not as deep as the animal soul, because the animal soul is klipas nega, is not from Kedusha. So therefore, when it recognizes where it is, it completely despises itself and its state of being, and that catapults it, like he's going to say, that when dafke kasher seirisi ba nefesh habamis mitzaratzma, that when dafke, this type of it comes from the animal soul on its own, not one from the divine soul. The im dafke kasher says the im seirisi man. The ima is because if the awakening comes from the divine soul, and that in turn awakens the animal soul, then the awakening of the animal soul is also not that deep. It's only when it gets awakened on its own that it's hit a place that only it is aware of how dark it is, not due to the animal, the divine soul. But on its own, it's with a profound and a very core essential pain and distress, with a very essential and very core essential bitterness and he cries with bitter tears. He cries with the bitterness of his soul. He's crying on his evil situation and state of being. Like the tshuva of Rabbi Lozer ben Dardaya, the Goa b'bchia at sheyotze nishmose. So the Gemara says Rabbi Lozer ben Dardaya was a person who lived the most sinful possible life. There was no sin that he did not transgress. And then he had an awakening at the last second of his life. And it says that he bent down the Goa, he's screaming, yelling, with horrible tears, until the point that his soul expired from him. And the Gemara says, Rabbi, and the Rabbi said, there's someone that acquires his world, which means the world to come, in one moment. Sha'achas means 1 hour, but Shah also means from the word one tenua, one movement. That in one movement, with one act, in 1 hour, he was able to achieve that because it came from such the depths. When a person realizes they lived a certain life, and then there's that the awareness of what horrible type of life they live. That teaches that reaches the deepest place. That's what I was calling rock bottom. That the Nefesh Elikis will never have that. Because the Nefesh Elikis never reaches a point of such no return. Nefesh Elikis is in prison and it's terrible pain and it's a deep gullus, and in many ways can be even worse than the Nefesh Habamis, but not this type of absolute despair. Liyese, why is it the case that he was able to acquire his world, the world to come in 1 hour, in one moment, in one move, one tenua? Liye is the tshuva zu, because this type of tshuva that comes from that deepest dark place, magie b'pchinis primis v'atzmus shalamayla gam mokara er. Okay, here he says it explicitly. It reaches in the inner and the core above. That's even higher than the source of light. Because the nefesh elikis at the end of the day is light. It's just a light that has descended into the world of darkness. Whereas this we're talking about is reaching a place in the soul in the deepest place, and above in a place that's higher than the source of light. What we called earlier Helam or Helam Atzmi. Doesn't use that word here yet, but he will use it and has used it. So it's higher than Eir, and that's where this level of Hamtokas HaGvura is B'Sharshan. The Sheirish of Gvura is in the place that's higher than Eir, and higher than Chesed, and even higher than Rav Chesed, and higher than Chesed of Atik, of Ksheit, as we shall learn, because it's coming from a place that's not Eir altogether, but it's coming from an Atzmizdika place. So there's a place that is no light at all. It's a place of no light, no Giluyim, there's no divine expression or revelation. That's what this darkest of places reaches. That's what he says here. Pretty intense and powerful stuff here. Okay, now let's stop here, and a good time to discuss or questions or anything you'd like to say. Just again, for the record, it's not over. If you look at the next paragraph, he's going to go further to analyze the Keteris and obviously explain this idea much more. But he's given us, I think, the basic ingredients of what this third level looks like and where it's coming from, and its contrast to the first two levels, which come from Oyer, Nefesh Elikis, and so on. But here, the floor is yours, my friends. Go ahead.
Rabbi Jacobson, Rabbi was fond of the Viktor Frankl and his way of psychology and how he perceived and how he, presented, what psychology is and how his take was on it. And the idea was that when in the darkest of moments and when somebody's in severe trauma, the only way out was to give it meaning. And if you did that, and that's what made the person be able to move past and be able to move on and get themselves out of that negative environment. In a sense, that's exactly what it seems to be, that in the worst, it's not the nefesh elokis, it's not the godliness, it's what your nefesh bahamit gives it the meaning and finds the good point, and from that secret ingredient, as if it was, makes you be able to move forward and move on.
I don't know if that's what he's saying here. Here it sounds to me the other way around, that it's not due to the meaning, it's due to the darkness. It's due to the fact that there's like no hope at all. What you're adding is that meaning I would compare to earth. Meaning means that there's still some meaning in all of this. Here it sounds like it's complete despair, but I hear what you're saying. I don't know if I would equate that exactly with this. So it's open for discussion. Maybe it's connected to it, maybe not. It's true that meaning does redeem and help somebody get through the darkest moments, but I don't know if that's what he's saying over here. Here it looks like that there's something in the very despair, in this feeling complete, where there's nothing left, that causes you to access something that's beyond any revelation or anything like that. So it sounds to me even deeper than that what you're saying.
Yeah,
that's
I think George
like.
is saying. I think he's saying more of the type 2, Ayin Beis.
The type 2 it comes from Chesed. This type 3 comes from Gvura, from the Gvura itself, from the animal soul itself.
Agree.
Its own bitterness. That's clear difference. That's one comes from light that shines in a place like that and has the power to transform it. And here it's coming from within. The comparison is very clear. The comparison is whether it's coming from the nefesh elikis or coming from the nefesh abamis. So even though I think there's a connection to finding meaning in the darkest places, but there, that's the qualification I would make. But again, being that we didn't finish the topic, I reserve, let's see how he develops this. Maybe there'll be more points, more levels, different aspects of it. I do know that we're going to go now for at least a good, we're talking here now, close to 20 more pages that this is going to be discussed. Then when he brings it back to Einoid, so there's plenty to review, but this is what he's established so far, yeah.
Your preamble in the class today, where you suggested that this great despair and awakening, if you will, or this desperate plea for tshuva to get out of that ditch is perhaps in the sense that it's coming from Gvura, that there's a kedusha of klipa that is hidden, buried in the darkness, that is essentially almost like a failsafe, if you will, to the lowest failsafe to prevent the neshama from really getting completely lost. So it's very, very compelling, and it makes a lot of sense. Is there some sources for that? It's unlike you to kind of not speculate, but propose that that's what's going on.
First of all, I would I would just rephrase a few of the words you said, even though the general gist of it is correct. I didn't say it's the Ur of Gedusha. I said that it's the God, like he says here, that's higher than Ur, that has ultimately is the root of this darkest of place. It's not like that a person is completely forsaken. So it's true, it's like the last fail-safe, that's a good way to put it. But it's coming from a place that is the root, sherish of Gvura, which is not in Ur, and not in Chesed, and not in Nefesh L'kis, but in that place, what we learned earlier is Helama Atzmi. That would be the little rewording I would do, just to make it more accurate. I've spoken about this in other classes, not necessarily based on this piece in Ayin Beis, but I find it to be something like this. There's a concept of, everybody's heard of hypothermia. So hypothermia is a phenomenon where, especially children for some reason, who fall under ice in very freezing conditions, freezing water, where there was a time that there were no vital signs, and they were actually declared dead. And there were children buried. And later they discovered that they weren't dead, because there's a state of hypothermia where the human being will come to a point, which is the rule in general, that the body in its brilliance, in God's brilliance, you can say, when it goes into shock, even though it has plenty of problems, there's a reason it goes into shock, because it's trying to save itself. So it's trying to preserve. It's like someone has, they have to save 100 people and there's a fire burning. You try to save whatever you can. So the body goes into a state where it will save the vital organs. But then there's such a deep state of shock, which almost nothing is left. So even the brain and the heart won't show any sign of function. And yet there's still a spark alive. I'm just using the word spark. That's the language we use. And they discovered that, and then they were able to revive, especially children. I think children, because their metabolism or because the way I'm not sure exactly why by children it's more than adults. But regardless, and they saved lives that way. So whenever I thought about it, I always say to myself, wow, God forbid no one should ever fall into ice, and no one should ever go into shock, and no one should ever have any of this. But if it does happen, God in his infinite wisdom implanted in the body his immune system, a profound wisdom to do things. Because why does the body know to do that? How does it know to save all the energy just to keep something alive until you can revive the person? So then, and this came, I don't want to go through the whole history. It came through my working with people. And as a naive young man who didn't really see tremendous pain in my life, thank God. But then I began to be exposed to people who suffered very serious trauma of all sorts, emotional, psychological, due to abuse of all sorts, some of the worst possible. And I was trying to wrap my head around it and came to realize that it's like a twilight zone. It's a very different reality when a human being goes through terrible things in life, especially children. And this is what came to me, which is very much connected. So I don't know if it's a source, but I think it has some sources here. And this is the point. that there's also a psychological hypothermia and a spiritual hypothermia. So I don't know if you've ever heard of this, and no one should ever know of this, and no one should ever meet anyone that's experienced this. But when children especially endure terrible abuse, and I'm talking about really bad abuse, things like, I don't even want to say it, but I'll say it, sexual abuse, rape, and so on, and especially at the hands of a close one. There's a proven concept that they become out of body because the pain and the trauma is too much to handle. To see someone that is supposed to love you hurt you like that, you can't in any way contain that. So what happens is the child literally experiences it like it's happening to someone else. And these children, when they begin to speak about it, if they can speak about it at some point in their adult life, speak about it like it happened to someone else. It's like, I saw it happen, as if like something left their body and watched it happen, but it didn't happen to me. And there becomes, I don't want to call it split personality as a diagnosis, but there becomes a certain two different personalities. The person who experienced the trauma, that child, and the one who witnessed it, and the one that witnessed it doesn't want to deal with that trauma. So there's a certain disconnect and dissonance. And a person like that can grow up and almost have two identities, which evolved into the concept in psychology called healing the inner child. What is the inner child? We all have an inner child, but the inner child that gets disconnected from the adult. So the adult has all kinds of defense mechanisms and can be a tough person and seemingly very confident. But the truth is it's all a veneer, like an armor hiding deep vulnerabilities and deep insecurities, like two different people. And they don't let that person out, the child. And that's why a person like that can get married and have relationships, but the relationships can be very skewed and worse than that, because there's a part of the person they never brought into the relationship. You never made peace. And in many ways, I mean, it goes on and on. I don't want to go into more and more detail into it. In the healing world, the goal is to reconnect to your child and reintegrate, because you can't live a life of two people, the person like the outer adult and the inner child. But I was thinking about it. Why would God do that? That in a way is like a hypothermia, because it was the only way for the child to save itself. Because it would be literally beyond suicidal for the child to be able to accept that something happened to me. So in a way, the disconnect was like the hypothermia, the disconnect. And then this idea got confirmed when I was reading a letter from the Rambam to Rabbi Avadia Hager. Rabbi Avadia Hager was a very big scholar in the time of the Rambam, and he was named Rabbi Avadia. He was a convert, and he became a great leader. But he wrote to the Rambam a letter once, bemoaning the fact that as much as he's achieved in his life, at the end of the day, he's a ger, he's a convert, and he doesn't have yichus. His ancestry doesn't go back to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. Very vulnerable letter, which is interesting for those times, talking about 1,000 years ago. He writing to the Rambam, and the Rambam responds as follows. On the contrary, your yichus doesn't go through human beings, it goes straight to God. What does that mean? He says it goes straight to V'hoya, Misha Amar V'hoya Eilam. It's a reference to the way we described, to the one that spoke and created the world. So our yichus, the ones that are born Jewish, go through human beings, great human beings, but still, it's humans, and yours goes straight to God. Now, the Rambam wasn't just being cute, and Rabbi Avadia Ger was no child. He understood things. So clearly, there was this element that you have a connection that goes all the way straight to the source. And one final thing, since you asked me the question, so I have much to say on it, actually. And Chazan Joseph Malavani, the famous Chazan at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue for many years. He's still around, but I think he's retired. I actually knew my father. He was once by the Rebbe by dollars. There's video of it. He tells the Rebbe that he's traveling with his wife to London to see his autistic child, who was already in his late 20s, and he's in a home there. It was clearly a very serious case of autism. I mean, there's many levels of the spectrum, but this was very serious. And clearly they put him in a home. So the Rebbe says the following words to him. He says, they say that autistic children, you can't have a social connection with them, a human connection. But we need to know that they have a connection straight to God. And never forget that. In other words, don't think they have no connection. They have a connection straight to God. And the Rebbe says, so therefore, make sure you put a tzedakah pushka in his room. And Malavani responds to the Rebbe, yeah, my son loves tzitzis, arba kamfis. We gave him tzitzis, and he seems to be very connected to his tzitzis. This was the Rebbe's words. So so putting all this together, I developed these ideas somewhat. I can't say I 100% know that it says it somewhere, but since you asked me, and I decide I'm sharing that I believe that psychologically speaking, all this comes to tell us that even when a person has lost everything, and even their father and mother have forsaken them, abused them, or hurt them, or in some way not have been available to them, maybe unhealthy in their own way, never think all is lost. Obviously, to have nurturing parents and have nurturing family and nurturing community is an unbelievable gift. But there's no such thing as complete hopelessness. And hypothermia shows that, as well as the psychological instances, like with the autism, and what the Rambam is saying to Rabbi Avadia Ger is saying, yes, you may not have the Giluyim, the revelations, the Oyer of Avram, Yitzchak, Yankov. I mean, you have it obviously as well because it's Nimshach Beruchnius, but not genetically, biologically, but you have the connection directly to God, which has its own Maila that's even deeper. So that's part of how I would elaborate, if I were to elaborate on this. Obviously, I'm not going to say this is all in Ayin Beis here, but reading some of these lines, it pretty, like, especially this last line, that it reaches a place that's higher than Mokara Oyer, that to me, like, really drives this point home. And I'm sure they'll read more. Anyway, I elaborate a little more, maybe Lekovit Shvuos. So that's my take on this topic.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you very much. Is there anywhere in brief follow-up question? Is there anywhere in Chassidus where it talks about the the energy of the clip of that comes from the ore the kedusha that comes from Acharaim? We talk about what fuels the Sitra Achra. Is there anywhere it says that can be reharnessed or redeemed or converted?
That's a chapter 7 in Tanya.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of it. There's plenty of discussions. There's sichas from the Rebbe on it. In some ways, we're going to learn it here. This is called the tshuva. It transforms doinus to zachis. Doinus is deliberate sins. It's quite bad. You're talking about shalosh klip satmeis now. You're talking about sins. What are you referring to? Something specific?
No, I'm thinking about the Tanya where it explains where a Sitra Achra, where the Sitra Achra, where it gets.
But Sitra Achra just means the other side. There's a lot of levels of Sitra
Achra. And I'm not sure that it's stated any more specifically in Tanya. It just says that it gets from Macharaim. No?
You're speaking Hebrew, and I'd like to speak English because I don't know the words. What are they? Not sure what your question is. The whole chapter chapter 6 and 7 talk about this very explicitly, and it's not short. It's pretty elaborate there.
No, I know that, but the idea of tshuva is somehow redeeming that, or that giving rise to tshuva.
That's what he says in chapter 7. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back and read it again.
The end of chapter 7 talks specifically about tshuva elevating the sins and the negative into positive, which is also the theme here somewhat. So I'm not sure what you're quite. You asked me if tshuva is discussed, transforming zdainis to zachis. Of course, it's discussed. Starting from there, in many places. I would suggest reading that and seeing what your exact question is.
Yeah, no, I think you're speaking to it. I need to refine my question, but you're answering it.
Okay. Are there any other questions? So we'll stop here at the end of the paragraph, top of page 1326.
By the way, thank you. That was a brilliant exposition. Really, thank you very much. A special treat to hear you for bringing like that. Thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Use it well. I use it all the time, by the way, in my work. It's not just theories. I think it's one of the most profound psychological tools that Chassidus teaches that even secular psychology has not yet reached that place. So there's a lot that you can use in this, in real practice and real interventions.